We found in the last few years in particular, strategic surprise coming out of North Korea. We have seen in the case of China in 2009 and 2010 timeframe, coming off of a script that was hiding military capability and biding their time. Now we're seeing the introduction of high technology weapons that are anti-access area denied. While all of those issues continue to go in every domain, whether it's the establishment of an air defense identification zone, or it's disputes in the Senkakus, or it's disputes in the South China Sea, or it's disputes with land borders. There should be no surprise that we're seeing all of these issues now go into the cyber domain. So the challenge for the U.S.-Japan alliance, we have competing demands, real security demands, that are now placing great demand on all of our resources. We have a budgetary environment that is significantly challenged. In the case of Japan, there's a debt ratio here that's very difficult to manage with the impact that Fukushima has had on the power plant industry and energy imports in particular. Increased operating tempo for all of our units, and now real vulnerability and exposure in architecture that was designed for access that now introduces real potential for cybercrime, espionage, and hacktivism. So as we take this discussion and move into the disputed claims area, I wanted to show you how tightly knit economic exclusion zones work in areas where countries cooperate with each other. What you're seeing described here are the clouds or the areas that we call economic exclusion zones around Pacific Island countries. What you're also seeing described here is the fight for fish in the tuna belt. Countries in this region have to surveil and enforce their economic exclusion zones. If they do not, and other countries intrude, then they run the risk of losing resources. Yet, if they confront countries that are intruding and poaching in their economic exclusion zone, they run the risk of escalation to the point of armed conflict. Now we move the mosaic that appeared to be orderly for the Pacific Island countries into the South China Sea. And you can see how the lines are drawn among countries in the region. China introduced the NineDash Line as a core interest in the spring of 2010. We think the submission of the NineDash Line, or the Cow's Tongue, that extends 1,600 nautical miles into the Straits of Malacca. We think that submission was timed with a submission requirement directed by the law of the sea on extended claims to the continental shelf. Those submissions were due at the same time. It's my personal view that China saw that coming and did not want to have to arbitrate with other countries, and put the NineDash Line on the table for everyone to look at. When challenged and questioned, particularly when I had a chance to meet with Wu Shengli, my counterpart in the Chinese Navy, I asked him, how do you characterize this water? Is it an interest, a historical interest that you have? Is it a sovereign interest? Help us understand how to represent what you're trying to do here. The language used was, it's a core interest, which means that China is willing to place a bet on the future of its leadership in control based on internal control of the South China Sea. It's a very difficult proposition for anyone who exercises freedom of navigation in international waters to accept. We have a long-standing issue with cyber. I placed this quotation up here because of the words that are used, the person who's giving it, which is a lawmaker, a respected lawmaker in the United States, and the date. That was 9 years ago. And you could use the same quotation today. We have a significant issue with cyber. We have a significant issue in terms of how we think about it and the lessons that we have learned with rational actor models and deterrence theory in trying to apply it to cyber. Right now, there is no deterrent for individuals or state actors to take offensive action in the cyber domain. So this is a roll-up of how we see China and their approach and their engagement to the region over time. They have a very sophisticated approach in terms of strategic communication, of direct trade and direct economic investment. Their convenient interpretation of international law, as well as growing military capability. We think it would be useful to understand Chinese game theory, to understand China's moves in the region. This is why we propose an application of the game Go. To understand what their objectives are, to understand what fuels the trajectory that these moves in the last 6 years have taken place, to understand the role that geography plays in the region, and to realize now these rising tensions are taking place everywhere. South China Sea, East China Sea, in the air, on the water, on the ground border with India, as well as in the cyber domain. So if the objective of Go is to put pressure on you from as many different perspectives as possible, so that all you have to do is yield in order to make your life better, then we can see the Chinese moves as very coercive to all U.S. allies and friends in the region, particularly with the Philippines as well as with Japan. We see it with Vietnam, and we see it with all the ASEAN neighbors. I think the advice that we're giving, that we should give to the next administration in the U.S. Presidential cycle is to expect pressure. It's not necessarily a countdown to war, but to expect pressure. The introduction of a Chinese combatant into the Senkaku territorial water region presents escalation. And I have real concerns about leaving the control of escalation to naval commanders to try and interpret through radar displays the intent of other ships. This is a formula that we have to be very, very careful about. My country has, unfortunately, experienced what miscalculation at sea can do to the start of hostilities. 58,000 lives later, now Americans look back on the Gulf of Tonkin, and they look specifically at the two ships involved, USS Turner Joy and Maddox, and they ask, what started this war? Those two ships were intelligence-gathering ships on a passive control, collecting intelligence. They did not go out to start a war. So I think we can start to now pull lessons learned from Operation Tomodachi forward in a way where we can apply them directly to the security environment. The idea that we have goals that focus on bilateral security, that together we provide a continued stabilizing role in the region, and that we examine closely what the implications are now for the peace and security legislation and what that implementation means for the self-defense force. But we have significant challenges. The U.S. has been talking about rebalance for many years, and the impact and the effect of that is simply not clear. We have real issues associated with political and economic guts, sustainability, leadership. And my personal take on it is a very short-sighted approach that loses a clear understanding of the sacrifice that's been made by many people before us to bring us to where we are today. Operation Tomodachi was not possible to think about in 1960. It wouldn't have been possible to think about in 1970. What made it even possible to consider today is the long-standing relationships between militaries and between governments, between businesses, between families. The idea that we would have officers in the United States Navy of Japanese descent who would themselves make the recommendation that the name of an operation in response to an earthquake and tsunami and radiation release should be Tomodachi is indication enough of the benefit of this close friendship and partnership has had over decades. I think the Prime Minister has it exactly right. You have to have security enhancement and economic development. If you don't have that, then we don't have the means possible to go forward with the ideals and the goals that we all agree on. So let's just remember what this looked like, both before and after. We built an organization that was not on the books. The Joint Support Force that responded in Operation Tomodachi was a force that recognized that if we came into a situation like this, where there were 49 different countries trying to participate in the operation, where all of the ministries were engaged and involved, the self-defense force was playing a key role. And if we tried to come in and view this operation through the traditional lens of vertical arrangements with senior subordinate authorities and resources, then we were going to lose. We needed something very, very different. We applied the principle of unity of purpose rather than unity of command. We thought horizontally rather than vertically. We insisted on collaboration in ways that there was no U.S.-only meetings. My colleagues, General Bancho, General Riki, were part of every day's battlefield. Every day, the bad news and the good news came together so that we could understand each other's reaction, and then we could plan together strategically, operationally, tactically, what our next move would be. This is an operation where we had humanitarian assistance and disaster relief that were in play at the same time. This was an operation where we needed to anticipate what the next move was coming out of TEPCO and coming out of Fukushima. In order to do that, we needed to understand when releases would occur in the atmosphere and where people were located so that we could give them timely, actionable advice. So when we think about the lessons that truly endure from Operation Tomodachi, there's a couple of things to think about. While none of us could have prepared or expected through predictions this cascading set of casualties and conditions, the mark of an impressive team is that you can learn and you can grow under pressure during a crisis condition and adapt and improvise, and in this case, pivot from humanitarian assistance to missions in response to the nuclear disaster, to fight the fear of the unknown and the invisible with a force that could land on its feet within hours of an unprecedented crisis and prove beyond measure what it means to be a friend. While this joint support force that I've described may have set its own records as far as responsiveness and the delivery of logistical supplies, it also required extraordinary levels of technical skill and communication to address and respond to the radiological crisis. But what made it truly exceptional, in my judgment, was that it was not simply a narrative of another military operation. In my view, it was much, much more. What made the operation unique and special and remarkable was the promise and the potential of the idea of Tomodachi. There is a noted American author, philosopher, and lecturer, Jacob Needleman. In his work, The American Soul, I found it instructive because it informs us great ideas begin with an ache. The physical and the emotional loss was hard to comprehend, much less calculate. In these circumstances, the name of the military operation took on an even greater degree of tangible and symbolic meaning, especially since it is a word that represented so much more than the simple execution of an operation. In Needleman's words, the mark of great ideas is that they act to unify the disparate parts of the human spirit and have the power to bind people together. Tomodachi taught us something that we didn't expect. It taught us what was possible. The idea was powerful because it represented in its purest form what our partnership meant and what it could become, based on a vision of what humanity is and what it could become. Interestingly, the vision and the drive to move our two countries closer together in our understanding of each other predates this event by more than 100 years. At least one example to consider demonstrates the roots of true friendship, and that dates back to the late 19th century when Nitobe expressed the desire to bridge two sides of the Pacific. In 1905, he published Bushido, The Soul of Japan, for Western audiences in an effort to reflect the true spirit of Japanese people and shape a closer relationship between the United States and Japan. The American Soul and The Soul of Japan, two works, two sources of insight, separated by more than 100 years, both make an effort to understand the psyche of our own respective culture, our own respective societies, and our own respective people. And with that understanding, finding the key to unlock the promise and the potential of a partnership between nations and close friendship between people. I was very proud to be able to express to the Prime Minister that Tomodachi taught us that nations have interests and people have friends, and that this disaster demonstrated for all to see that we're going to take real risk for friends. For as long as there are real challenges ahead and real work to be done, as long as there is suffering, as long as there are people in need, and as long as there are forces that challenge peace and prosperity, our work together must continue. As long as we make commitments to each other and resolve to stand for each other, our friendship will endure. And the spirit embodied in that friendship will never wither and die. There was a certain spirit to what we were doing, to unite against impossible odds and prevail. So we owe it to those who lost their lives, to those who risked their lives, and those who continue to live with the cold, hard, brutal hardship of this indiscriminate tragedy, one that destroyed everything in its path, to move that spirit of Tomodachi forward, a spirit that left an imprint on our souls and a call to action in our hearts. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for Q&A, and we are doing it in an American way. And I found that in Japan, in Symposium, usually people do not ask questions. So that's not so many questions, but we would like to do in a way that we are usually doing at this interview. So please raise your hand, and then I'd like to, if you have a question, and I'd like to open the floor, open the discussion to the floor. And if you have a question, please raise your hand and then identify yourself before asking the question. And the microphone will be delivered, so please wait for the microphone. Who wants to start?
Thank you very much for your very impressive and useful speech, sir. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Kishiura, joining JASDF Kokuji. I'm not Kaijo. And now I'm a student of Keio University Graduate School of Law, and Admiral used to be naval aviator, and so you for Blue Angels, correct, sir?
Yes.
I'm also a search and rescue pilot. And 5 years ago, I was commander of air rescue squadrons in Chitose, Hokkaido Prefecture. And I also took part in the huge-scale HDR operation in Higashi Nihon mega earthquake disaster. And we got a lot of lesson learned during this operation. And the most impressive I got a lesson learned is I'm concerned about degradation of operational capability, especially conventional warfare capability. Recently, the number of such kind of huge-scale disaster increasing, and U.S. Allied forces have to attend such kind of HDR operation, and some of U.S. military personnel concerned about same concerning. How do you think about this problem, sir?
I think I can speak directly to the U.S. side, and maybe you can let me know if that's representative of what the self-defense force is going through. The U.S. is on an unsustainable path. And as long as we have a strategy that is so far-reaching, so unbounded, and an operational tempo that continues to eat away at a peacetime investment strategy, we will run out of wing life on airplanes and hull life in submarines. We will not be able to manage the force. And so let me put that answer in a broader context. Prior to 9/11 in the United States, we had what was called a general purpose force. Across the range of military operations, from low-end counterinsurgency to high-end thermonuclear war, the force was in the middle in terms of its overall capability and what it was designed to do. It would shift from one contingency to another without much impact. On 9/11, 19 individuals had strategic impact. The bulk of U.S. investment after 2001 went into counterinsurgency. Counterinsurgency investment means that we focus on building a network to defeat a network, all fusion intelligence, and the use of special forces to go after pattern of life analysis to find, fix, and capture or kill terrorists. That was a significant amount of resources to accomplish that. In the meantime, the world did not stop, and we see the rise of the nation state. The friction generated by nation states requires a different programmatic investment. It means investing in integrated air and missile defense. It means high capital ships. It means cyber, it means electronic warfare, and the rest. The country does not have money to do both ends. As a result, what we're doing in the United States is taking ships that would typically have 1/3 of our force underway, 1/3 of our force in maintenance, and 1/3 of our force preparing to deploy. Now we're seeing 46% of the force deployed. And that means that we are robbing ourselves of the ability to do deep maintenance. We're deferring that. And what that means is we will not get the full life out of those platforms that we're expecting. I'm not sure the utilization rates in Japan. I can tell you, though, that in operational terms, the current strategy and path that we're on is not sustainable into the next decade.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Council General.
Thank you very much. You did mention, but out of your very almost moving speech, and I think what was not really mentioned was that also a huge cost incurred upon Americans who are involved in Operation Tomodachi, and so we are really grateful for that. And I really liked your liking the Chinese strategy to go. It tells us a lot. And I would like to know, because you are expert in dealing with this go type of strategy, what is most important elements in terms of the naval capability, like the deployment of aircraft carrier, or nuclear submarine, or monitoring capability of P3C, or things like that. What are the most important elements?
Thank you very much, Councilor General, for your question. To begin with, I think it's good to understand history and the assumptions that we make about our ability, particularly in the West, our ability to influence China. For many years, we presumed that we could have an influence on China, that if we engaged with China more, they would become more like us. That if we work more closely together with China, that they would want to have aspirations to be a Western-style democracy. I think this is all folly. I think we have understood now the mistakes that we've made over time, and it begins with a clear understanding of the role that China has played historically. China participated in World War I to support the Allied effort. China provided conscripts, they provided labor in order to support the British and the French draft efforts. And when the Treaty of Versailles came, China was so displeased with how the Treaty of Versailles played out. We see shortly after the Treaty of Versailles, the seeds planted for the Chinese Communist Party. So if there was ever going to be an effort to influence China, it was back in 1920, 1921. And that effort since has failed. To understand what we are up against when you are playing Go, you need to understand what fuels the passion of the person that you're playing against. To understand what historical trajectory are they on. in the Chinese view, after 150 years of shame, they are now expanding their approach to regain their rightful place. There have been many engagements between U.S. defense secretaries and Chinese representatives and counterparts. The one that is most memorable, that answers your question directly, took place when Secretary Gates was the defense secretary. And the Chinese were objecting to the sale of U.S. arms to Taiwan. So much to the point that they broke off military-to-military communication. Secretary Gates brought his objections to his Chinese counterpart in Beijing and said, why are you upset that the United States is selling arms to Taiwan? It is about the only thing the United States does consistently in foreign policy. It is to sell arms to Taiwan to maintain the status quo. The Chinese response was revealed. We tolerated the sale of arms to Taiwan when we were weak. We are no longer weak. So you have a potential adversary, a determined competitor, who is going to view the role that government plays is one where it's advancing the Chinese civilization rather than advancing China as a nation state. We need to understand who we're talking to on the other end of the table. They are very determined, and they are listening very closely to our words. And if our actions don't follow our words, then they see that as a sign of weakness. So if we draw lines in the sand or we draw lines in the water, then we don't take actions, particularly on the part of the United States. The Chinese view that as an opportunity to move another stone a little bit closer to what we value. In this particular case, they are challenging our relationships in the region. They are challenging our relationship with the Philippines. They are challenging our defense agreement with Japan. They really want to find out what that means. And so what we should be prepared for is pressure. And whenever possible, coercion. And you know the best way to fight the Chinese when it comes to this kind of debate and argument? It's with a camera. It's recording, the Chinese brazen behavior at sea and putting out in public for all to witness. When I had a chance to spend time with the Secretary of Defense in the Philippines in 2010, I told him that there is a tribunal in the law of the sea whose express purpose in life is to address disputes at sea. And I was very pleased over time that the Philippines had a plan to move their arbitration discussion into The Hague. It is something to watch here, because I think Admiral Koda has it right, which is that as more pressure comes to bear on China in the international community to account for its coercive language and behavior, then they will simply shift their tactics, not their goals, shift their tactics to either another region or another perspective where no one's looking or when no one's focused, and they will exploit it that way. So you have to be prepared, I think, to adopt the Chinese view of the long war, the long fight. In some cases, authors have described it as the marathon, where this is going to go on for our lifetimes. And if you really value a relationship, or you really value the economic exclusion zone around your features, then you'll have to surveil it and enforce it. The challenge that we all have now is the introduction of escalation and trying to understand how to de-escalate a problem that should be taken care of very locally. But as we found out with drunk fishermen at sea that are ramming into Japanese Coast Guard vessels, we can quickly have a situation escalate to the point of an embargo on rare earth metals. That should have never happened. Yet, with China, it will. I wish I could be more optimistic.
I'd like to take one more question.
Just I think both the United States and Japan learn. Sorry, I'm the former retired Vice Admiral Yoichi Koda, the Commander-in-Chief of the fleet. And my question is, both the US and Japan learned a lot of lessons from the Operation Tomodachi, especially your experience in Japan. And one thing that is not well discussed in Japan is the Japanese government understanding of keeping the US deterrence capability, even in that disaster. For example, because of the unknown size or unprecedented size of the nuclear radiation, the worst scenario could be the fighter squadrons in Misawa could be contaminated and could become inoperable. If that happens, perhaps the US deterrence capability in the area will be substantially degraded, or even the US Naval Air Force in Natsuki were to be contaminated. Another US naval deterrence capability in the area will be substantially reduced. And my observation, of course, I was retired, so I had no direct impact on the Japanese government. One, of course, in the rescue side, both the US forces and the Japanese side did a tremendous job. And also both governments made a tremendous effort to help the Japanese people. But at the same time, there are still some security threats that could challenge the status quo of the region. So my question is, based on the media reports, I don't think I get any Japanese consideration on that area in terms of the preserving or paying attention on the Japanese effort to preserve the US deterrence capability as a host nation. So I'd like to have your thoughts on this area.
So I witnessed it firsthand. The point that the Admiral's making is one that actually played out during Operation Tomodachi and was probably simply not reported. We are responsible for both nuclear as well as conventional deterrence. And these kinds of calculations, particularly in terms of national catastrophe, are critically important to the calculations that go with focus of effort. Because the last thing that military leaders who are in positions of responsibility, great responsibility, would ever want to do is to unintentionally create a vulnerability that would show either a weakness or an opening that would be exploited by a potential adversary. And the sad reality of the world that we live in today is that there's real adversaries out there who would want to exploit it. During the course of maybe the second or third week into Operation Tomodachi, there was a scheduled exercise that was to take place off country. It required the movement of U.S. airplanes to South Korea. And the U.S. side was very concerned that any movement to leave Japan at that point was going to be problematic because of the already growing tension with people who wanted to leave Honshu out of fear. General Riki was very direct, straightforward, and had an immediate answer to the question when it was raised. He wanted a the absolute deployment of forces to go as scheduled because of this very concern that you were expressing. This was a substantial U.S. Air Force movement, but it was exactly to the point that you raised. That for anyone who's watching, when it comes to national security matters, particularly matters that affect the alliance, the conventional deterrence or the nuclear deterrence associated with the alliance, everything is held together and continues as scheduled.
Thank you very much. So we will continue discussion tomorrow. So tomorrow we will have a full schedule starting at 10 o'clock. Registration starts at 9:30 a.m. And we are going to have a discussion on the issue of U.S.-Japan relationship and security in Asia-Pacific for the whole day. Well, please, thank you very much for coming, and please join me for holding Admiral Walsh again. We will adjourn.